colors. They can change the mood of any image or scene, and learning more about them is something I wanted to do through the art challenge I'll talk about today, Chromarch. Chromarch is a challenge focused on exploring color palettes in artwork, or at least that's what I did, and Chromarch seemed like a good name for this challenge, so it's what I went with. Hi, here's May, and today I'll go over what chrome and chromatics mean, how I experimented with over 30 different color variations in multiple illustrations, and what I learned from this. I'll also share different ways you can challenge yourself with color. Let's get started. The word chrome comes from the Greek word chroma, meaning color, while today it's often associated with metallic finishes and reflective surfaces. Its original meaning relates to vibrant, diverse coloration. Chromatics comes from chromatic, referring to the science and study of colors. In art and science, chromatics is about the properties of colors like hue, saturation, and values, the relationships between colors such as complementary and analogous hues, the emotional and psychological effects of color combinations. That's why I wanted to use Chromarch as a name for this challenge. It's all about creative exploration through color variations. For this project, I experimented with over 30 different palettes on 10 character illustrations. Here's the process I used for this. First, I chose color palettes. To decide on my color palettes, I picked colors from multiple artworks by artists I admire. Here are the main artists I used for inspiration: Lotus Bubble, Masamune, Kuroshiro, and Kurume. I've done art style study videos on these artists before, and I wanted to incorporate their color choices into my color experiments. For the base version of my illustration, I picked the colors myself based on what I naturally would use. To apply the color palettes, I made use of the fact that I normally use a predefined document structure for coloring and refined this. For each color, I would use a group that had a base layer at the bottom and the following clipping layers on top: a first shadow, a second shadow, a light hue variation, and finally reflected light. An exception for this is the eye white group, for which I didn't include the hue variation and reflected light layers. I painted in the colors and fully shaded the illustrations using the base palette first. For each of these clipping layers, as well as the base, I focused on using just one color based on the color palettes. This enabled me to simply put layers that were filled with a flat color on top of each clipping layer. Each clipping layer got its own group here, so I could clip the layer filled with one color on top of each one of them after I was done with the shading. After this, I simply had to export all the versions. One problem I ran into was the file size. With all the 30 clipped layers for each group, for each color, the files would get very big, making it very slow to do anything in the document. To resolve this, I separated each color into a separate document. This meant I had to export each color as a separate PNG. It was a simple task, only having to toggle the visibility of layers multiple times, but it took a long time, around 3 hours for each character. Small side note, I have a daily routine where I include passive tasks and I watch YouTube videos as I work on these. This exporting task was good for those times, but it would have been way too boring and simple for the times where I have some more concentration, so I made sure I would only export the illustrations during my passive task time. Now back to the process. After exporting each PNG version for the colors, I combined them in another document. I basically had a PNG image for the skin of color palette 25, a PNG image for black parts, for white parts, for blue parts, and so on, and each palette got its own group in this export document where all of these would be combined. Additionally, I had to add the eye reflections and line art on top of this, and I added a color-based version below our color layers. For the line art, I figured out a way that this could appear visible on top of all palettes using copies and multiply or overlay blending modes. For palette 12, I had to add several darker layers though, since this one was a lot darker. After I had the full PNGs for each colored version, I then added the background, and like this I had all my versions. As you can maybe tell from this process, it was experimental and rather complex to me. Along the way, I tried out some things to save time, some of which worked while others didn't. I'm gonna share these next. I hope it helps you in case you would like to experiment with new processes in the future. First, some things that didn't work. To not have to manually toggle the visibility of all the layers in Krita, I tried using Clip Studio Paint's auto action function, which allows you to record an action and then repeat that action. For my specific purposes, I would have to use the same document structure and do all the visibility toggling and exporting only once, and then I would be able to just hit the auto action and all versions could be exported for future versions. At least that's what I hoped. But even after multiple attempts, I wasn't able to get this to work. Maybe it's because I'm not that familiar with the function. I watched some tutorials for it, but still I wasn't able to use this in the end, and after around 8 hours of experimenting here, I determined I wouldn't use this to export the versions. next some things that worked. To save a lot of time with importing files in Krita, I used file layers in the exporting file, where I combined the PNGs of the different colors for the final version. That way I just had to make sure to use the same file structure when exporting the separate color versions, and then I copied and pasted this into a current export folder, which was used in the final export files. This reminded me a bit of video editing, where I often use the replacing files option to use the same template but with different videos or images, for example. One thing that you can't do with file layers though is paint on them or transform them. Luckily I didn't have to do that since I just combined the different color PNG versions. Finally, I would add that keyboard shortcuts saved me a lot of time when working on the project. I also discovered that clicking on the visibility icon just does that for one layer in Krita, whereas pressing the keyboard shortcut to toggle visibility applies it to all selected layers. That meant I could press Ctrl to select all the versions of one palette and toggle their visibility to be able to export the next version for each color. And that's how I created all these variations. As mentioned, after exporting the final PNGs, I added backgrounds and used them in edited videos. If you want to explore color palettes in your own art but don't want to repaint everything manually, here are some alternative methods you can try. Use HSV filter masks, curves and levels to tweak colors. Try overlaying multiple layers for shadows or using layer modes like hue, screen, burn and saturation to adjust colors. One great approach is painting in grayscale first, focusing on values, and then using gradient maps to assign colors. If you separate color groups into different layers, you can apply unique gradient maps to each one for more control. Additionally, painting in grayscale first also ensures that values work, which is essential for using any color palette. If you want to take on a color challenge yourself, here are some ideas. Apply new palettes to an existing piece. Generate a color palette randomly and create an illustration based on it. Each week or day, try different types of palettes. Here's an example of this one. In week 1 you could focus on a monochrome palette, going for one hue with different shades. In week 2 you could then use contrasting palettes, including complementary colors. Next, for week 3 you could go for harmonious palettes, which could include analogous or muted tones. And finally, for week 4 you could use experimental palettes using randomized unconventional color combinations, for example. A good way to approach this challenge is to decide on a theme and an objective. For example, your theme could be exploring color relationships and your goal could be to find your top 3 favorite palettes from the experiment and analyze what you like most about them. Like this, you are able to apply what you learned to future illustrations. Finally, I'd like to share some key attributes to consider when working with color palettes. First would be hue shifts, such as warm versus cool color variations. Next, saturation levels, which can include muted versus vibrant tones. After this, brightness and contrast, how values impact mood and depth. Another aspect would be color variety, how many different colors are present in the palette. What's important as well would be mood and storytelling, the way color choices affect atmosphere and emotions. Finally, I'd add an approach I like to use to analyze color palettes. I've used this multiple times in my art style study videos before. You can look at the changes in hue, saturation and value compared to the base color for each shading or lighting color. In general, grouping palettes into categories like warm versus cool, high contrast versus soft gradients, pastels versus saturated colors can also help you analyze how color influences your work. This challenge is all about learning and experimenting with colors. Through my process, I've realized how color shifts can change an illustration's mood and impact. I also learned that while creating 30 versions of an artwork was a good exercise, it was way too time-consuming, and I want to be more mindful of repetitive tasks in future projects. I look forward to trying alternative color challenges in the future. Which color palette and illustration I included in this video do you like most? If you want to or have tried a color challenge, let me know about it in the comments. You can also share your ideas and insights on colors in general. You can find full screen recorded process videos as well as time lapses and full resolution images of my art on my Patreon. Thanks for watching, have a nice day and bye.